In a previous episode, we looked at the Board of Inspection and Surveys report and saw all the material deficiencies in Blueback in 1990. The report concluded that the material deficiencies made her unfit to carry out her assigned missions, and the cost to upgrade the ship to keep her relevant for further combat operations was prohibitive, so its recommendation was that Blueback be stricken from service. However, this still raises the question of Blueback's continued serviceability. We'll examine that in this episode here on Down Periscope, Up Periscope. Two of the more common and fairly reasonable questions we get from adult, i.e. non-children visitors are, 1. Could Blueback ever be put back into service? And 2. Would the US Navy ever take the submarine back? In theory, yes, but realistically, no. To put the submarine back into service, you would have to fix all of those material deficiencies discussed in the previous episode and unconvert the submarine from a museum ship status. This is all assuming that the Navy would even want to recommission the vessel and put it back into full operational status in the first place. So all the propulsion systems, the weapons, the sensors, etc. would need either upgrading, refurbishing, or replacing. Now simply getting it underway under its own power would be a far less intensive task, but even that would face major hurdles to overcome. This does bring us to the issue of obsolescence. When Blueback entered service in 1959, she was state-of-the-art, brand spanking new, one of the top submarines of her time. However, as the inspection report made apparent, by 1990, 31 years later, much of the equipment and spare parts to service that equipment no longer existed or was no longer being supported. This is even more true nowadays. Aside from that, all of its combat systems are now 30 plus years out of date. Regarding the hull, generally speaking, when Blueback was built, a submarine's pressure hull was good for roughly, let's say, 30 years of service, give or take. Now this is not a hard number, but it's related mostly to the physics of it. The pressure hull can only withstand so many cycles of diving down to test depth and surfacing before the metal eventually begins to fatigue out. However, this does vary. For example, some of the Los Angeles-class fast attack subs and the Ohio-class ballistic missile/guided missile submarines have been in service for over 40 years. The former are gradually being replaced by the Virginia-class, and the latter are scheduled to be replaced by the Columbia-class. Still, it's sort of analogous to try running an obsolete diesel-powered hybrid truck for 30 to 40 years as the parts slowly degrade and reach obsolescence over time, to the point where you can't even get replacement parts for it. That's sort of what it would be like. Furthermore, recall that the estimated cost of reactivating the Blueback back in 1990 was around $55 million, and the cost of replacing it was about $171,200,000. If we adjust those figures to 2026 dollars, it would be around $137 million to reactivate her, and about $426 million to replace her. Now, there's an important thing to bear in mind here, that is just an inflationary adjustment based on reactivating or replacing Blueback with equipment or a submarine that would be up to a 1990 standard. Now, in reality, reactivating or replacing Blueback with 2026 modern equipment or a modern diesel-electric submarine would be considerably more expensive than that. For comparison, let's look at some more modern Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force diesel-electric submarines. Now, I'm a bit more familiar with these as opposed to other countries' diesel-electric boats, so they serve a fairly good analogy. The Japanese Oyashio-class submarines that were commissioned from the mid-1990s to early 2000s cost about 52 billion yen, or about $470 million in 1993 per boat. In today's money, that's, say, a little bit over $1 billion. The following Soryu-class submarines, the first which was commissioned in 2009, had lead-acid batteries and an air-independent propulsion or AIP system. Those cost about 60 billion yen, or about $555 million in 2004. In 2026, that would be roughly $970 million. And if we go even further, a very modern Taige class submarine, of which Japan just commissioned its fifth one back in March of 2026, costs about 68.4 billion yen, or about $434 million to build. Unfortunately, though, I could not find the costs of any of the Japanese submarines before the Oyashio class, such as the Uzushio or the Ushio classes, which actually would have been more contemporaneous with the Barbell class, like Blueback. Those were actually the first two classes of submarines in the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force that had teardrop-shaped hulls. And it's even more appropriate because they were, in fact, both of them direct derivatives of the Barbell class. So, based on the above figures, these more modern Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force subs cost within the range of about $434 million to $1 billion in 2026. This is indeed more expensive than the adjusted cost of $426 million to replace Blueback in 1990, but then again, we are looking at the figures for more modern diesel-electric submarines. Truth be told, it would be easier and simpler to buy a modern Japanese Taige-class diesel-electric submarine than it would be to put Blueback back into service. Even in 1990, her systems were so old and becoming so dilapidated that it just made more sense to decommission her. So imagine trying to take her now and update her with modern equipment. Yeah, you've got your work cut out for you. Given all the aforementioned problems, it does beg the question of not if Blueback could be put back into service, but rather, why on earth would Blueback be put back into service and expected to do its job in the present day? Now, there is a clause in the agreement to transfer the vessel over to the museum that states that in a time of quote-unquote national emergency, the submarine could be recalled by the Department of the Navy. But think about that for a minute. It would have to be an emergency of such extraordinary magnitude that the Navy would have no other recourse than to recommission a 60-plus-year-old diesel-electric submarine. At that point, recommissioning Blueback, or even a handful of museum submarines, would not make one iota of difference. I mean, the country is probably facing some type of existential crisis and is likely already doomed. So, just a handful of diesel-electric submarines won't do anything. Now, let's take a step back and just talk about the Blueback as a museum ship itself. The conversion of Blueback into a museum ship required a number of changes to the boat, which effectively made it unseaworthy and unable to dive. For starters, there's a giant hole in the side of the hull that is the museum entrance. That hole would have to be sealed off and somehow made watertight. The screw, that is, the propeller, is unshipped and it's placed on land as a memorial, so you'd have to put that thing back on. The flood ports in the bottom of the ballast tanks are plated over and welded shut, so you would have to cut those open. Similarly, the bow doors on the torpedo tubes are welded shut, so this thing ain't firing weapons anytime soon. And there are also numerous plugs in the hydraulic systems themselves, so you'd have to somehow find those plugs and remove them all. You'd have to open up the air header so the diesel engines can breathe, and somehow reactivate the engines themselves, which haven't run in over 30 years. They would more than likely just seize up immediately, so you'd probably want to soak them in oil for a bit. Plus, you'd have to replace the generators and the electric motors. Then we're going to have to send someone down to a gas station for the diesel fuel, and another person better call the auto parts store so they can get some acid to put in the batteries. Or better yet, never mind that, just get brand new batteries for the submarine. Finally, you'd have to remove the lock that is physically keeping the propeller shaft itself from turning. Now, I'm sure there's a lot more things that need to be done here, but those are just the issues that I'm immediately aware of. Still, a number of systems on the submarine do still work, so when a tour guide tells you, don't touch the buttons, knobs, switches, and valves, we do actually mean it. We're not just saying it just to say it. If you turn the wrong valve or touch something, you could actually damage things or set off alarms, so don't do it. However, in terms of this thing going to sea again, it cannot happen. But hey, don't take my word for it, okay? To really drive home the point that this thing is never going to go anywhere ever again, the agreement to transfer the vessel over to the museum specifically includes a clause that says the boat is permanently moored here as a static display for the purposes of being a submarine memorial and a science exhibit. Furthermore, the clause states that the museum would not reactivate any system on the boat, quote, for the navigation or movement of the vessel under its own power, end quote. The only time it could move is if the Department of the Navy recalled it, which we've already established would not happen, or if it needs to be moved to a shipyard for maintenance or repair, in which case it would be tugged there. Now, this did last happen when Blueback was dry docked in 1998, but that was the last time she has ever moved as of 2026. She has never moved under her own power since 1990. So unlike some other submarine museums out there in the US, which can actually still start and run their diesel engines, Blueback absolutely cannot. I think that makes it pretty clear that this thing isn't going anywhere. So sorry, campers. Blueback is never going to be a submarine ride. We're not going to take river cruises or dive the submarine underwater and have a fantastic voyage on Blueback. What you get instead for $8.50 a tour is a 40-minute tour where we describe life on a submarine and how Blueback works. It's basically a history lesson. If that's not what you were expecting, well, sorry, them's the breaks. Additionally, there is a clause in the transfer agreement that says we cannot reactivate the galley and serve food on the submarine. Even if we clean the galley, there's probably enough grease, dirt, and grime in there that it would probably start a fire immediately once we turned on the griddle or the ovens, so I'm not going to take that chance. It's probably not up to modern day health and safety codes anyway. Now, OMSI recently began holding birthday parties in the main museum building itself, so kids can now stuff themselves full of cake and ice cream and run around like banshees in the museum. Well, I mean, they already do that anyway, but now we've just added refined sugar to it. So, every so often, when we enter the cruise mess, visitors, most of them children, say, "I'm hungry, are we gonna eat here?" No. Why not? Because this is a museum exhibit, not a Chuck E. Cheese's. We do not allow any food, drink, or gum on the submarine, period. So we occasionally have to stop parents from pulling the snacks out of the bags and stuffing their kids' faces when we enter the mess decks. No food on the submarine is in fact a blessing. Why? Well, food tends to attract bugs and other pests. The chemicals in the food would also significantly speed up the deterioration of the submarine and its artifacts. It would take too much time, money, and energy to serve food, and lastly, we don't want to clean up a sticky, gross mess off the artifacts, the tables, and the floors every single day. Ugh, that would just be disgusting. No food on the submarine, kids. Sorry. Instead, if you want to take a nice river cruise and have good food, I would recommend the Portland Spirit. They have nice river cruises, and they have pretty good food too, actually. I've been on it. So the TLDR is that Blueback could theoretically be put back into service if you somehow manage to fix the laundry list of problems with it. However, there's literally no reason for this to occur. There's no reason for the Navy to take it back, repair it, upgrade it, and recommission it. It will also never again move under its own power, and it will remain a museum ship for the rest of its days. So hopefully that pretty much answers the question of, could Blueback ever be put back into service? Sure, but no, it never will. Well, that's all I have to say for that, folks. It was a little bit long-winded, but that's what it is. It is a museum piece now.